homework for this class other than what you guys had started working on was trying to work towards this clear button, getting a clear button enabled of some kind. And so I'm interested in if anybody made any more progress on the clear button from where we were as a class, or if you got stuck. What you got stuck on, maybe, if you did get stuck. Anybody? No further progress on this? Nothing to report, sir. All right. So, I mean, today we're just going to keep building on this exact same project. Hopefully, you know, people who are remote have a harder time collaborating again, but hopefully we'll be able to get through having a basic stopwatch put together by the end of the class today is sort of the goal. What I'd like to do next class is maybe play around with pulling in a UI element framework and leveraging some of that. I think what I'll do is post a few options today or tomorrow to try to get people to go look at some of them and maybe get like a poll like we've done before. Hey, we're interested in, you know, this one looks interesting or something. And then we can head down whichever direction we want to go to for that. But that'll be after we get past the rest of the functionality on this. So yeah, until then, just to make sure we're all again at the same point, if you weren't already there, like if your code hadn't reached the point where we had this, it looked like this with this clear text for a button or something, you don't actually have to run these first, you know, couple steps unless you haven't gone out and grabbed this repository yet. I just left them up there in case there's anybody who hasn't cloned this. If you've already cloned it, then just get into whatever folder you have for your stopwatch, like React stopwatch. Do git pull, and then git checkout lesson 2. That should put you at the exact same point in time code-wise that we're at up here, so that everyone's running off the same base going forward today. Now, if you've made changes to any files, like you tried to modify the clear button, you tried to get it working, it may complain, it may tell you that you can't do that. So what's the easiest? I didn't think of the easiest way to enforce that you'll be if you do have that problem, if you use like -F when you check out, it'll force the checkout, I believe, of that. What that means is any of your local changes will be overridden by whatever the state is for the project, but that should get you to the same point in time that we're going to use for the base today.
So when you do npm install, you have to always do it within the file that you work out of?
In the folder, yeah. Now you don't actually, again, you don't have to run npm install in this one. I left all of these instructions here in case somebody didn't clone the project last time. npm install only has to be run the first time that you clone this project, or if you add a new external dependency. Other times, since there's nothing new that we added in for this, you could just run npm start. Won't make a difference, but I really wish there was a cleaner way to, when you do npm start, to run install only if something's new. I've never found one. There might be something out there, but I've dug around. There's ways to do it, but it's all a little bit hacky. But then we should all be, once we get through that, we should all be at the exact same point in time. No, I think that's fine. But, so once you're there, we're back to this point in time that we were at from our last class. We've got our start button, which only changes its state, and we have an unimplemented clear button, sort of the start of a component there. So let's get started collectively, because you guys had a little time at the end of the last class to try to work on this clear button somewhat. What would, if anybody did make any progress on it, what approach did you take to building out this clear button, or making it into a button that we could use? What's that? Create the button tag. All right. So that's a lot like what we've done before. I come here. I'm going to get rid of the word button here and put a button tag here. Again, I'm going to do this type equals button, which is, you don't have to do it in this case, but it's sort of a safeguard. That's like creating a button tag, right? We've converted it over. Let's see what that does. Oops, wrong direction. Oh, React must be in scope when using JSX. So we haven't imported React over in this file. So we have to include that here. Now we should have, all right, we got a very basic clear button. It doesn't seem to do anything, but there we go. And where would people, any ideas on where to go next for this clear button? So what functionality does it need to do, right? What needs to happen when you click the clear button? Restart the time, right? But we don't, one thing is we don't have a time really being tracked yet. So we're sort of setting something up that can't really accomplish its whole task yet. But we could maybe act like it does, or I'm not sure. I mean, we've got a basic button there. We can also go look at our start button. I'm going to minify some of these bits, and we can open them up again. Put my clear button next to it. Is that going to work? No. All right. Let me see here. There we go. So we put them up there next to each other so that we have a little bit of a reference. Let's start asking questions, because if they're both buttons, maybe they have similarities between them. Maybe they don't. Maybe they need some of the same stuff. So in our start button, we're changing the text on the start button, for example. We're not doing that on the clear button. So that's something that's pretty simple. The text will never need to change for this. But we'll probably need an on-click passed into our button here of some kind, right? The same way that we are on the start button. And that's when we click it, we want whatever that action to be to clear our timer or reset our timer, right? So we've got a couple ways we can manage that, or several different ways. But what I would do right now, because we don't have an actual time that we're connected to anywhere, is let's sort of act like there is. Let's make this coded up a little bit like that exists. And then our choice here is we could convert this to a class-based component and add whatever this on-click calls into our class as a method. We could pass in some sort of function, some method on our props that we want to call when we click this button. Or we could even just define another function here, like that's going to do something when we click the button. You know, instead of tying it to the function, we could call it like on clear or clear timer. I don't know. So out of those three, can anybody give me, and this is what happens when you're actually doing any sort of development like this. What are some pros to the idea of having it be a method, turning this into a class-based component and having our click behavior be a method on our class? What's that? What would be some of the benefits if we treated this like we did over here, at least right now, for our start button, where what we did was we turned this into a class-based component, and our on-click behavior is all local, and then the state is all local to this button, so it's sort of managing everything. We added that, we converted this over to a class-based component and made this a method. What are some of the advantages or pros to that approach?
Being able to save state.
Being able to save its state locally.
Maybe using the component mode method.
Right. Sure. Can anybody think of any challenges that we would have if we tried to make this a class-based component, make that a method inside of this?
It seems like the functionality of the clear wants to go like reach outside just the button and go to the whole app.
So that's an interesting thought, right? Is it doesn't really feel like clicking this button is something that we don't change. Like, does the text of the button change when we click the button? No. So then what state would the clear button manage in the first place that it would need to manage internally, like locally? It probably doesn't make sense for the time, if we're going to save the elapsed time somewhere, to exist inside of our clear button. So without that, it might be a little weird to have the click behavior be a method on this and managed internally, because it doesn't really have state. It's sort of just a button there to change the state of something else, right? So I'm gonna say, okay, I think we can rule that out as an option. So that leaves us with two other options in a sense, right? We could have some sort of function that we just call, which, to be real, isn't significantly different than having like an on-clear method. Or we could pass what we want to happen when we click this button in as a prop and then hook it up. So what would be some advantages about passing it in as a prop? What? It's simple. Reusable. Yeah, it's reusable because we haven't tied, like, this button doesn't define its behavior as much anymore. It's just giving a little bit more of an interface. So it makes it more reusable. It might be able to use, even as a clear button with hard-coded clear text, we could reuse that same thing to clear different things. Oh, in this app, we use it to clear the timer, but in another place, when you've typed a whole bunch of text in an input field and decided you don't want it, you can just drop your clear button on there and have it clear the text because you didn't tell it what the whole action was that it's actually performing, right? You let something outside of it define it. Can anybody think of any cons to that approach? Any challenges? Okay. So let's try that approach, right? So instead, I'm going to get rid of this little clear timer here. We're going to treat this a little different. And this is the idea of, what is this called? I wish I could remember the exact term for this. This is a little bit of like optimistic programming, if you will. Assume it's there, right? Because we don't actually, like, this doesn't have to have had someone calling this or passing the parameter in for us to write this function now. So instead, we can just decide, what do we want to call this, and add it as a property on our props inside of here. We can say they could pass in on click as a property, and we're just going to assign that to the on click event handler. Or we could call it something else, on clear, or something, right? So let's call it on clear, just so that we don't get confused between on click and on clear. And that's perfectly fine. The code should still be working. We're just not actually passing anything in there, but it's sort of optimistic in the sense that we've said, oh, this will exist. Somebody can pass something in here. We don't yet know what that is that they're passing in that we want to call when this button is clicked. We just know that it's a valid property. We gave it a name, and we'll deal with it later.
It's an empty property, right? I mean, basically, there's the props, but it would be null or undefined or false.
In any, so far it is,
Right.
in any place.
Props not unclear.
So let's go look at where we're calling our clear button, right? Where we're using it. Here at preview. So right now, we're calling it from this app, the app or whatever, and we're rendering our clear button. But we're not passing in any props. So we could just pass in whatever prop we want right now for this. Oh, what did we call on clear? And so now we can make that do whatever we want, right? So in this case, you know, being a lazy developer, I'm just going to write a quick inline arrow function that's just going to call console.log for now and say clear button clicked. So that's all that's happening. We're passing in a function here for this on clear. Then when we render the clear button, that's hooking it up to, that's being passed into the on click property, if you will, of the button, which is an event handler, which gets called by HTML whenever you click something. So now let's go take a look at this. I'm going to pull up the inspect over here, look at our console so we can see what's happening. And if we click clear, we see that we're adding, all right, clear button click. So we're triggering it. So the awesome part about this is, as was said, we haven't done anything that defines the action of what happens when that clear button is clicked inside of that clear button. So it's very loosely coupled. It means it's very easy for us to change this behavior, and we don't even have to change the clear button code at all at this point. So we have what is pretty much a functioning clear button component without having had to write much more than what we had before. And what we'll see is we probably don't need to touch this component when we start making other changes. So what's, we can go back and look at what our notes were here, the different things that we have. What's the next thing that we want to try and build out? We built out a start pause button, although it's not really hooked up to external data. It's changing its own state. We've built out a clear button. What component do we want to go with next? We could go with this higher level stopwatch that sort of groups everything, or we could try and build our time display. Let's build the time display. Doesn't matter to me.
Then hook it all up.
Build the time display and then let's hook it all up. Okay. So let's just spitball this as a group real fast, and then we'll probably break out, just like we did last time, into small groups to try and work through some of this. Well, let's talk about this. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Let's talk about the time display. What would this time display component need to be able to do? What are some properties of it? It might be really simple. I don't know.
Show or something.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it doesn't even have any actions. Like that's the challenge here, right? Is you're like, well, there's not an action. I mean, it shows time, right? It just displays the time. Now let's ask some questions about how we want to do that. Well, I guess we don't really need to right now. We can defer that. So if this time display just shows a time, then we need to know what format we're passing this time into the time display in. What does it look like for it to display? And that's, I mean, there's a lot of different ways you could format a time. Let me try something here. I don't actually know if this is even going to work. I want to get rid of all of that spammy logging that we have going on in our clock. All right, there we go. So I'm going to test something real fast here because I don't know if this is even going to work. All right, yeah, I think that works. Like, wait, what?
Yeah.
So let's do this. Let's assume, I was just playing with something. Let's assume that our time display, what it's going to get as its format, is the number of milliseconds that, like, it's just going to get a number of milliseconds. It'll display off of that. So this would be the equivalent of 5 seconds, you know, and 34. Well, this is milliseconds. I don't even know. This might be more precise, but yeah, this is 5 seconds and then 34 milliseconds, I guess. Pretty sure that's what it was. Let me try that again. Time 2 equals. Yeah, so it's more like, that seems right, about a little over a minute from when we started. Yep. So let's assume we're going to get in our time display a number for our, just a moment. Let me get the term right here. In our time display, let's assume we're going to get a number that looks like this as one of our properties. And do we want to give that, we can all agree on a name for that property if we want. We could call it just time. So let's assume it's going to get that. And then what we want it to display is the number of hours, minutes, seconds, milliseconds broken out. Does that seem like a reasonable next step for our time display? Not too complex, I hope. We could just display this number directly first if we want to, and then we can refine it. So let's start with that. Let's do it. Just display the time that gets passed in just directly as a number. And then let's work towards refining it step by step. Um, so if that's the case, what's our first step to creating a new component? We've been doing this a little while now. We're just going to create a new file. All right, let's get in our source folder here, just like any other time. We'll create a time display at JS. And then I'm just going to be properly lazy, like any other time, and steal from something. So let me go over to the clear button. Start from this, sort of borrow it, but it's not going to be a clear button. It's going to be a time display. And right, and probably makes sense. We don't need the clock up anymore. Let's add this in here. Let's import it in our app.js so that we can use it. Just like we have with any other component that we want to use. And then let's just render a time display right here. And what did we say was the property name we wanted to use? Time. So let's just pass in some sort of time to test it with. Like, all right, let's go over here and see what's going on. See if we've blown up. We haven't. We're just showing this showtime text because we didn't put anything else in there, but we're passing a time in. So I'm gonna give you guys, I don't wanna wait too long because it's pretty simple to just show that number. It shouldn't be that hard. So let's do like 5 minutes. You can split up into groups again if you want. This one is pretty basic. So if you don't wanna split up into groups, that's fine. And just convert this time display component so that it shows that number getting passed in. If you get done earlier, you can put your hand up just so I know, and most people are done, we'll move on.
I'm sorry, can you give the directions again?
Yeah, so what I want to do is let's change this over. So instead of showing, right now it says show time here. Imagine that what it'll show is whatever the time prop is that you're passing into it. So, you know, I could change that right now, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but that's not, you know, the right way to have it change over. We want to just show the time. I'm going to go back to my app.js and put a line break between these real fast, just so that they're not right up next to each other.
Yeah, by the way, I think you're right.
Okay. Down there.
Wow.
That is a car. That person has no hearing.
That person has some crazy bass.
Yes. Go on the other side of it. Yeah. Oh, that's where you need your.
All right, do we have the time displaying the number yet? So we'll just sort of take this step by step. Let's sort of show how we evolve something, because this is the same way I would be building out a component if I'm building it, right? So the next step I'm going to do is I've got a very basic component here. Now I'm going to try and use this prop being passed in to display it, which is just the time. Oops, I don't need this quote anymore. That's my problem. And it should be showing whatever I pass in. So now I should be able to test that by coming back over here and going into my app.js and changing this number. And seeing that it changes. Super simple, right? Not that hard. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and close some of these other ones while we're at this. So the next step here is, let's try and format this, let's try and give it a little more formatting. Let's break it down by seconds, hours, minutes, seconds, milliseconds, and try and display it that way instead. So that's going to just require, that shouldn't be too bad, but it's really nothing React specific here. For the most part, it's just breaking something down. So let me just make sure, somebody may need to double check my math here to make sure I do this right, but I'm going to write the equations on the board. I think it's all right, which is really simple of that's a weird knowing yes. So whatever your number is, x divided by 1,000 equals the number of seconds. And So I'm going to, so I'll change this, so I'll use these names. I'm giving you a huge, so the number of seconds divided by 60 equals the number of minutes. And minutes divided by 60 equals hours. I'm going to change that so it says, as you see, but that should be all you need to do to break it down. The one tricky part might be holding on to the milliseconds. So if you have a hard time with that, feel free to, for now, just show the seconds, minutes, hours. Let's see here. We'll do till 7:20 on this. So that's about 6 minutes to work through. Yeah.
Run, I can't do npm start and run it. And initially it said that there was something running on the server already. So I killed the 8080 server, but it was just bad code. Let me actually just remove this. And it still wasn't running, and I'm not sure. I just need npm start to run it, correct?
Yeah, that should be all you need.
Okay, so this might be an issue with Cloud9 then. Okay.
That should be fine. So I think it's running now. Or, all right, so do this. Let's, that's a little weird. All right.
Yeah,
So if you hit Control C to kill your server.
yeah.
Okay, so start it again. So there's something weird going on with the way that Cloud9 is starting the development server. I think it's starting it, but I don't think it's showing it. So try and scroll up from here, see if you can in
Okay, so
there.
that's a weird thing. Like I can't actually scroll up either.
Yep. So I think what's happening is there was another server running.
Okay.
And now it started this one on a different port, maybe.
Okay.
And I don't know why. So we could check for that, you know, run some console scripts. It's probably easier to
Okay.
start. Let's see here. Starting the development server, which should be what does it, and then it wipes that page.
Okay, I'll keep.
So, all right. What is the command to look at the running processes?
Oh yeah, I was.
You could do like a PS or something, or look at things that are connected to ports, which I can't remember off the top of my head how to check your ports and what's being used. Try this is weird, but try local host instead.
Just
without the 8080.
Okay.
Yeah, none of that should work anyways. So localhost shouldn't work because localhost should be serving up localhost from your system. So what you should need is the IP address that it's running on. So go over to your Cloud9 real fast. Let's try this.
Should I close it again?
Yeah, go ahead. Click the preview button up there real fast. I just want to see. Click show active servers.
Oh, nice.
Okay, so it's got none. All right.
Oh, so you can do this without even typing in the
I'm just learning. I'm figuring this out right now. So it doesn't look like anything's running. Okay, so let's try to do the npm start again and see if that's going to change our active servers count up there.
Oh. Good.
Okay, so we do have one running. Cool. So you can probably close this. I don't know if you can get to it from there. You might be able to, but yeah, close that and go up to your preview again. And if you said preview running application, or yeah, try that, but it's probably going to open it over here. Now try and put that instead in another tab because it's just, it never works for me in that when it previews it right there, right? I don't know why. Oh, maybe it was working in your preview tab. So I think if you open the app in either one of these, it'll probably work.
In which tab?
Either here or in your other tab, but if you scroll down, and that, I think if you, see, I think this is just warning you. So I think if you click open the app, it might work or it may fail. But you can try that in your other tab that you have too.
Oh,
Which is the same thing, right? It's because you opened a separate tab up there.
I see. Okay. Great.
There we go. Yeah, there's some,
Thank you.
I mean, there's some pains when you're doing the Cloud 9 bit, but. All right, it took a little while. So let's, anybody get this broken out into different time bits? Yeah? Well, we'll work through it collectively because this is more of a just exercise in coding. I should probably instead assign this as a, I might even do that. I might assign this as something to work on instead on your own to try and get this working. I think that'll be better because this is more, this isn't too React heavy. This isn't too complex. It's just an exercise in breaking stuff down. So we'll sort of leave this as it is right now. I'm going to add a little bit here. It's very advanced now. It tells you that many milliseconds. Look at that super advanced bit of code I added. Okay. So let's instead think what would be the next step. And to me, the next step is, well, now obviously we need to be able to somehow change the value here, right? So we've got some different bits. We've got a very, very simple time display, which I'll have as a homework assignment to make it more advanced, break it up into these different pieces of hours, minutes, seconds, milliseconds. We've got a start stop button or start pause button. We have a clear button, but none of it is connected together in any way. And we're not changing the value of anything in this time display. So this gets to one of these sort of React principles, which is why when I wrote down the components here, I had this idea of a stopwatch collectively. And that's the idea of what you do when you have common code or two different components that need to interact and share state in some way. And we have that in our app because the start stop button needs to change, or start pause button, keep saying stop, needs to change our timer in some way. And our timer wants to display a value. So those two are connected, and clear is the same way. It wants to clear this time value. So since all of those are connected, and yet we built them out as these very nice, simple, independent components, what you want to do in a React app, or anytime you're sort of building any application, it's just clearer in React, is this idea of hoisting that, or take that commonality and move it up into a parent component to everything. So what we'll do is we're going to build a stopwatch component that's going to hold on to this common bit of logic. So just like we've done with other stuff, we'll create this stopwatch.js. Now I'm going to actually, I'm going to start from the stop button, even though that means I'll have to take more stuff out. But the reason I'm doing that is because I know that I'm going to want this to be able to have state of some kind. So I'm just starting as a class-based component. But this thing is now what we want to encapsulate all of our stopwatch instead of putting them directly in the app. So once you have a stopwatch component like this, and we can, again, let's make this real simple, just like we've done with all these others. Stopwatch. Oh, I need to change the names of these things. So it's called a stopwatch. I'm going to import this in my app.js file, just like we have with the other ones. I'm going to go ahead and render it here. But then what I want you guys to do is the next step. So we've got a stopwatch here. What I want you to do is change the rest of your code. Now it'll involve changing code in here, in your app.js, and in your stopwatch, so that all of your logic for rendering any portion of the stopwatch, the time display, the start, pause button, the clear button, isn't in your app.js anymore. It should all be in your stopwatch components. So let's take a little bit of time. How much time do people feel like they're going to need for that? You want 5 minutes, 10 minutes to try and move stuff over into the stopwatch component? You're not sure? Let's go 10 minutes. All right, so at 7:40, we'll come back together and then we'll get that done, and then we're going to start doing the complex wiring bit. Well, I don't want to be too long. I don't want us to take too long. I want us to try and start getting to wiring some of this up. So let's go 5 minutes. I know it's a little fast, but let's try and get that done. Let me give you a tip right now, because it's the one you're going to miss, is don't forget you're going to need to move these imports over into your stopwatch file. You're probably going to forget to try and import those in there. But you're not going to import those anymore in the app.js. You're going to import them in the stopwatch. I'll be back in a moment. All right. I want to cut people short, but want to make sure we are moving along a little bit. So here's the way I would do this, and you might get hung up on this. Did anybody run into a problem, get stuck trying to do this? Move this over into the stopwatch? Because there's at least one tricky part to making that change. Some of it's pretty straightforward, so let me get rid of, oops, that totally did not work the way I wanted. Let me get rid of the comments here. First thing I would do is, I'm gonna go ahead and take, well, let's take my imports and move them over because I'm not gonna need them here anymore. I'm importing those in my stopwatch now. And then that should be fine, shouldn't change anything in the stopwatch. And then I'm gonna take the actual components that I was rendering, or the elements here, if you will, and cut them out of here and move them over into my stopwatch. And this is where there's a little bit of trickiness. It's not too bad though. So if we look at what we were doing in the app when we rendered, we're putting these parentheses around stuff. That's just to say this is all one statement. So we can do the same thing here, try and put parentheses around what we want to return. And then I'll try and render my items here. But you may not have an editor that's quite as friendly as mine in terms of telling you what the problem would be if you try this. If we go over, we're going to see an error in our console at this point, which says adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. And what that means is I can't just render these, pull these things over directly because they're all adjacent to each other. They're siblings, they're at the same level. So the simple solution to that is I'm just going to put a div around them so that they're all inside of this div, and then I'll indent them so that it sort of tells me that's what's going on. Now if I go look, I've moved everything out of my app and into my stopwatch. Nice and easy. And the really great thing about this, again, is the composability. So now let's say I want several stopwatches in my app. I can just declare those multiple times and get different instances of those a stopwatch component, which has different instances of all of the other children underneath it as well. So that pulling stuff out into components and then being able to compose stuff out of those components and reuse them very easily is sort of the key of learning how to build stuff effectively in React application. So now we've created a stopwatch component. That's great. We pulled stuff out into it. So, but what was the point of doing this? The point was we wanted a common place to manage some of this state, some of these things that are shared between all these different components. So now we have to start thinking, okay, let's cycle of working with this stopwatch. What's the first thing you're going to do to the stopwatch when you're getting started? Let's say you haven't done any, you haven't clicked anything on the stopwatch yet at all. What do we expect the stopwatch to look like?
Start at 0.
Start at 0. All right. So let's do it that in the most simple way we possibly can. Let's change it and we'll pass 0 into our display. The simplest change we can make to accomplish that. Done. All right. So at that point, is there anything else that matters about this initial state that we're not representing in some way? No. Not that I can think of. I don't know. Maybe there is. So what's the next action you would take with the stopwatch?
Well, this might be backup. This might be a bit more advanced, but you really don't need the clear button, or it doesn't need to have functionality when you're at 0. But we could probably save that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's pretty advanced.
Okay. Phase 2.
Yeah. So what would be the next, that's a good point, right? That could be a difference in your state at that point and what you do. But what would be the next action? Like what's your first action with the stopwatch that you're likely to take? If I had a stopwatch right here, I'm going to start it, right? All right. So let's take a look at this. We're passing the time into our time display, which is great, but how are we going to tell it that something has started? Like what handles that communication right now? We've got this challenge, this sort of problem. This start button is the start pause button is encapsulating all of that logic. So there's no easy way for us as this parent component, this stopwatch, to know when we've started or stopped, right? Because it's not part of the stopwatch, it's inside that start button. We can't go get that information. But that's common information. We want that information to be used by multiple components in here. So what did I just say is the pattern that we want to use when we're working in React or anything like this, and we want to have some shared information between components? You guys remember what the idea there is? Yeah?
Does it go in the state of the parent component and then pass down as props?
Yeah, let's talk about pulling that up, right? So this is all inside of this start pause button right now, but let's talk about pulling this state up into our parent instead. So I'm just going to go ahead and pretty much going to copy this code over bit by bit, because this guy is now going to manage whether we're running or not, our stopwatch, which also means if that's what manages whether we're running, we need to pause, because it's not going to be managing this itself. So it's not going to be able to do this off of state if we get rid of this out of its state. Instead, it needs to be passed into it somehow, right? So let's go back to, and I know this is reverting a little bit, but the point is this is sort of what you end up doing, just not as blatantly as what we did here. Let's go back to the idea of passing this in as a prop. So this .props is running instead of state. And then let's pass it in here is running equals this .state is running. So what we've done is sort of move this state up into our stopwatch component, and we're passing it into our start pause button and using it that way. So let's see. I still have my on click, and I'm still doing, I'm gonna get rid of this right now, even though I don't, we'll see if that lets me get rid of that. Oh, missing super, I'm just gonna get rid of the whole constructor. Let's see what happens here. Okay, so we're good right now, but we're gonna have a problem the minute I click start, because we still have our handler inside of our start pause button, right? This is what's trying to set our state to a different value. So if we moved our state up to our parent component, what do we think we should do with our actual event handler that handles the event? Yep. Let's move that up the same way. So I'm just going to, I'll change the name of it, but I'm going to basically just take it right out of here. Because because we still called it on is running up in here. This just isn't going to be on click. It's going to be on start. Debating, like, because this is also on pause, right? On start and pause. You don't really want to do that with a method name. That's usually an indication that something's bad. I'm just doing it to sort of indicate it's doing both. So we move that up and it changes the state here. But now how are we going to actually connect it in our start pause button? Well, we can pass it in the same way that we just did in our clear, right? So we could say, oops, wrong place. What do we want to call it? We could say on start, or we could just say on click. Either way works, right? I'll call it on start and pause right now, even in here. I'll say start or pause and rename it up here also. But I feel like it's a better on start or pause. So we're going to name it the same thing when we pass it in. And we're just going to go ahead and pass it right into here. Say, all right, when that happens, we pass into here. And then in our start pause button, what are we going to hook up our on click handler to now? Or our on click events for our button? On start or pause, right? All right. And now it's a prop instead of on us, so we had to do the stop props. Let's go see if we broke stuff, because there's a good chance we did. All right, maybe I didn't save a file, or maybe I broke stuff legitimately. Let's see here. Oh, no, hold on. Stopwatch, on start or pause. Let me come back over here and see where it blew up. It's in the stopwatch. Oh, yes. What am I missing in my constructor here? The magic bind equals this dot. Right. Okay. So let's try this again. And what we've done is we didn't change any of the functionality of our stopwatch as a whole, but we pulled that start and pause action up into this parent component, this stopwatch component, which is now managing that behavior instead of the individual button managing that behavior. Does that make sense as something that you would do? Like, does that feel comfortable pulling that up?
Can we go over that very slowly about, I guess I'm not really understanding pulling it up. So you're pulling the button into something else?
So what you did was you pulled, let me go see if, I think they write about it over here in React. Lifting state up, only here. So you can definitely encourage you, if you haven't, go try and read through this documentation. Some of it might be advanced because it's definitely written for people who are pretty solid developers already, but they do a pretty good job of describing a lot of concepts. So lifting state up is stating the same sort of thing. Often several components need to reflect the same changing data. That's what we were encountering, right? We need several things to care about, whether the clock's running or not, and changing it. What they recommend is lifting up the shared state to their closest common ancestor. And I think they may go through a different process for doing it than we did, but it's not that different. The idea is when you start realizing that multiple things need the same shared state, by far the easiest way to handle that is to lift it up to the ancestor of all those components that can handle that coordination between them and say, okay, well, I give the same state to you and you and you, and if any of you need to change it, you can change it by just telling me to change it. I'll change it and tell everyone again, here's what that state is.
Common ancestor in that case was the stopwatch component.
Yeah, in that case, it's the stopwatch component because that's the top level component and the things that care about it include, right now it's only the start pause button, but time display is going to care about whether we've started it or not, right? Very soon. So does that generally make sense? We feeling okay with this idea of pulling that stuff up? I'm seeing some iffy looks still. All right. Yeah, definitely, like I said, I recommend you reading through this React documentation. Just about nothing. The only thing we haven't really gone over here in much detail are forms. We haven't talked a lot about conditional rendering, although we've shown some simple examples, but forms we haven't really talked about at all. Everything else in here shouldn't be too new. It should be topics that we've talked about, at least in this main concept section. Once you get into advanced guides, that's much more complex. You probably don't need to go into any of those right now, but definitely this main concept section. If you get time, read through those, read through them again and again. It'll hopefully help those concepts really click. All right, so we've pulled this state up here now. We've got is running here. It's triggering state changes in this stopwatch. So we really haven't added any new functionality yet. So maybe what else do we want to change, or what do we want to have happen when we start running, when we start the stopwatch running? This is an interesting question. There's several different ways we could handle this. So, I mean, there's one other thing that we obviously want to do, but how we want to do that could be in several different ways. So what are we really trying to do when we click start on the stopwatch? If you click it on a handheld stopwatch, what are you really trying to do? You want to start the timer, right? You want to see it start ticking up. Okay. So that's the tricky part here, is how are we going to do that? I would say there's not a right or wrong way to do that. In this case, I'm not going to have you guys try and reason out how to accomplish the start of a timer. We're just going to choose one path and sort of go with it for how we're going to do that. And the way I'm going to do that is very similar to what I was doing just a little bit before. So if we have, we assume that when we click start, we want to start some sort of timer, then we probably want something in our state to change at that point in time, right? Something should change in our state. So maybe this time here shouldn't just be a hard-coded value that we're setting here. We should pull that up into our state as well. So let's pull that up into here. And let's say, like, I don't know, we could call it time. We could call it time started, which I think is what I'll probably call it right now. And I'm going to put null as the first value for it to say we don't have a time that we started. So the way I'm doing this, by the way, the way we're going to show the elapsed time on this stopwatch is not by setting something to 0 and then ticking up that value over and over. Instead, we're just going to capture the time that we start it, like what I was doing before when I was playing with the date times. And then we'll compare it against whatever the current time is when we render, so that we can show what the elapsed time is. There'll be some tricks. No matter which approach we took for this, there would be some things that would be challenging. But I think this one is just a little bit easier in the common path. It'll be a little challenging when we do some pause, when we add in the pause behavior. But the other approach would have been challenging in terms of just updating a value constantly or something like that. So there's trade-offs to each approach here. So this means we need to probably change what how our time display works. If we're going to assume we want some sort of time started here, then maybe our time display, well, maybe we don't change what time display has. Maybe we just show time here still. And this stopwatch handles the logic for computing that time for it. That seems fine. So if we're using time started, we can put a little bit of logic in here that's like, let's say time equals 0 initially or whatever. And I'm just going to let it be that way for now, actually. And I'm just going to say time equals time here. So we're passing in a time into the time display, but I changed it so it's not hard-coded. It's just off a variable. And that way we're going to have a way to sort of change that value over time. So the next thing we want to do is when we do our on start or pause, we want to change our time started. So how do we go ahead and change our time started for that? Yep.
Would it be time started, instead of being null, becomes a new date time, like this instant of time?
Let's go with that. Right. Time started, and then we're just going to assign it a new date. Because what that'll do is capture that point in time. New date gives you the point in time where you invoke it. And we're just going to store that in our time started. Now we might start noticing that we're going to have some naming problems here because we know we want to do that on start, but we don't want to do that when we pause, right? So we'll figure that out. I don't know. I'm making this up as I go along with you guys. But we begin to see, maybe it was a problem to put those two together here at least. Maybe we want to do something different when we start versus pause. Or maybe not. Maybe we'll have those in here and we'll have the logic inside of this function that handles something differently. But for now, let's go with it as if we're just starting it. Very, very simple. So we're setting a time started value here. All right. Now we've got the complex, the really complex challenging bit. So we know that this is going to get called when we click our button because we're changing our is running state. We can see our button here change. But now we're going to want to have some logic inside of our render that will show our time value based off of the elapsed time, because whenever render gets called is when we want to compute how much time has passed, right? So we're starting with time equals 0. Now we're state, so that's just a check to say that it's not null or anything. So we have a value there. This is, I don't want it to be falsy. Then what I want is, what did I do before? Do you guys remember how I got a number out when I was playing with the dates on the command line or whatever before? Yeah. So how can we get whatever time it is right here, just like we can anywhere else? New date. So I'm not even going to actually, I think this will work. We'll see. Oh wait, I need to assign this somewhere, right? I need to say time equals, so I want my time to be whatever the time is right now when this line of code runs minus the time started, right? This dot state dot time started. All right. I don't know if this is gonna work. We're gonna find out. So I see 1 millisecond sometimes show up there, right? Why do you think that's happening? Any guesses? So, yeah.
Are we missing something that tells React to render so often?
Yeah, we're not telling it to re-render. And so what's happening is it calls this on starter pause, changes the state, saves that, and calls render immediately. And sometimes it's calling render so fast that it's within the same millisecond, which is why 0 is still the value coming out from here. And sometimes it's 1 millisecond difference, which is why we get to see 1 millisecond there when we've clicked that button, because it took it 1 millisecond to figure out that, to get to that render call, right? So I'm going to do something here just to sort of show. Let me. Yeah, I'm going to do something here just to show what that some time elapses real fast before we do this other thing. This is sort of just a stopgap. You guys don't need to copy this, but let me do let initial time equals new date. And what I'm going to do is set a timeout. Actually, call this bit of code, and instead of doing new date right here, I'm going to do like initial time. And then I'm going to do it after like a second. So all I did here is I'm just putting a little bit of code in here so that we're capturing the time originally, but we're not actually setting our state for about a second after the button's clicked. So what we should see is each time I click the button, we should see something around a second or 1,000 milliseconds there. So that shows you that it is doing the logic, the bit of computation that we're looking for, right? But what we're not doing is the sort of looping render right now. So I'm going to back this back out because I don't actually care about any of that. Reverse. All right. And then what we'll do here, I don't know how I'm going to do this. So this is the part I've been dreading. This is the part. Okay, so here's my plan right now. Is what? Doing a rubber duck, talking. I'm rubber duck debugging. So my plan right now, which is re-render this. This is sort of the tricky part. Normally you wouldn't be doing something like this, right? So this is the bit of code here that's unique to this project that you're probably not writing in a lot of other ones, where you're telling it re-render repeatedly on some sort of loop. But it's a perfectly valid thing to do. We can. And so I am going to sort of do that just in a little bit of a hack because we've already done it. Trying to remember here. Did you guys do this? I think we did. For one of our earlier bits. So let me go over to our app real fast. Or actually our clock, I think. Let's see here. So here we're just ticking, right? We did this component did mount, component will unmount. Tick, changing our state. So that's a little different than what we were doing here. But we're going to do something still very similar. So I'm going to go ahead and steal this bit of logic. even though it'll be a little different. Put this stuff here, oh, horrible indentation there. Except instead of on component did mount, I'm going to put this in the start, and I'm going to set an interval the same way. So set an interval, this dot tick. This is going to have a lot of problems right now, right? I'm going to clean some of this up in a moment. But then instead of calling this dot tick, I'm actually going to call this dot force update to tell it to go ahead and re-render this component again. And this is really like, there's some problems with this, which we'll get to, why you wouldn't want to do this, because you don't want your render to be predictable. You don't want to call render without changing a parameter and have your output change. You always want render to give you the exact same value with the same parameters. I'm sort of hacking something here. Let's see if this works. Probably not. So let me try and do it not hacking it this way so that we don't cause the problem that I was talking about. I'm just going to get rid of this after all. So what I said here was you want render. Let me in fact, if we went to their documentation, be able to see it, but they'll say you want your render function to be pure. So what that means is every time you call it with the same props on your component, you want to get the same value back out, right? And that's not what we would be doing right now, because we're computing a different date, time, continually, right here. So how should we do this? I guess I changed my mind. See, look at this. After talking about how this route would be easier, I'm not going to go with time started. We're going to change this over. It's going to be our elapsed time. And it's going to start at 0 because that's how much time has elapsed when we start it. And yes, I cheated a little bit there. I had a little, some editor shortcuts. If you didn't see what I did, is I was able to select all the instances of it and change them all at once. So if you use Visual Studio Code or something like that, if you've selected a word, you can do the same thing by hitting like Command or Control D repeatedly to get every instance of that word to make a change like that. So I changed it over. I was like, all right, I don't think this is going to work well. We need it to be different, which also means we don't need to set our elapsed time when we start. Oops, I didn't mean to get rid of both those, because we're not actually changing. We're going to have our logic where, heck, I don't even think I need any of that. This time can just be this dot state dot elapsed time. All right, let's see what happens. We're going to be back. Now we'll always get 0. But what we can do is go back to this clock example that we started with and set some sort of interval that we're going to run when we start our clock. So we're going to do something very similar to what we had before. We're going to set an interval, and that'll be a tick. And instead of, I'm going to be a little, this is too much. Let's do every 10 milliseconds. This is still pretty aggressive. Your computer may have some issues trying to do this. We'll see. So we can write our tick method. This is some of the stuff that's probably not what I'd be expecting you guys to be struggling with. That's why I'm sort of working through it without having you do the hands-on bit first. This is the fiddly bits of this specific project, tricky bits. So in tick, because I set this interval, I want it to step every time. Now inside of here, well, first off, I'm going to be calling this, so I need to hook it up here. I want to set something in the state, which is going to be, if we assume this is going to get off for a while, so I'm actually going to change the way this works again in a little while, but don't worry about it too much. That's something that I'll probably just give you guys as the starting point and then talk about the change I made and why it mattered. But what we're going to assume is, all right, if I'm saying every 10 milliseconds here, and this is elapsed time in milliseconds, and I want this to run every 10 milliseconds, which is what I did when I set an interval, then when I set my state, I'm going to tell it that I want to change my elapsed time. I want it to be what the current elapsed time is plus 10, because roughly 10 milliseconds have elapsed in that intervening time. So now go back to the render. We're not doing any computation in the render, so we've cleaned that render back up. We're not doing a computation that varies based off the time in it. We sort of moved it out into this. Let's see if this works. We've got ourselves a timer. Looks like it's ticking up. All right. Now in reality, oh, we got some problems. Yes.
The question is, maybe it's stopwatch. Yeah. Can you remind me just this dot interval ID? What is the interval ID part of that?
So when you call set interval, this is where people need to get comfortable with learning how to read their documentation. So if you look up like how set interval works, and I use this, what I think is fantastic, devdocs.io site to keep a lot of documentation all in one place. Let me see if this is the right. This isn't quite exactly the same, but it's pretty close. So I think I'll find the descriptions, maybe not as, no, I guess it's gonna find the same one. So what set interval does when you call it is it returns, and you could name it whatever you want, but interval ID, which is a numeric non-zero value, which identifies the timer created by the call to set interval. This value can be passed to clear interval to cancel the timeout. So in other words, the value of interval ID, whatever it is, can be passed into clear interval if we want to cancel the timeout. Which sounds an awful lot like what we probably want to do when we pause, right?
Yeah.
We want to quit running our interval. So let's change our logic up in here on start or pause. And let's do something a little different than what we were doing before. Because now we want to know, inside of this, we want to know what state are we entering, right? What state are we putting ourselves into? And we need that value not just here when we're setting it, but we need it elsewhere to do some additional logic, right? So let's pull that up and out of here. Let is running equal not this dot state dot is running. All I'm doing there is getting the new value for is running based off what our current one is. It's the same thing we're doing here, but I pulled it out so I'll have that as a value to use elsewhere, right? And now what I can do here is, instead of setting it to that, I can change it to just set it to is running. So I'm just setting my state to my new value. There's actually a really nifty shorthand, which you guys don't need to know, but you could even get rid of that because there's a shorthand in the new ES6 that says if you have a local variable with the same name as the property that you're trying to set, it'll set it to that local variable name, which is really nice. It lets you do some sort of clean bits of code in places, but we know we want to set our state here, right? And then we want some extra logic. So what do we want this logic to be? If we're running now after we've made our state transition, what do we want to do? So if we just went from not running to running, so imagine, think of it like a stopwatch, literally like a stopwatch. What do you want to start happening when you click the button on it again? Starts ticking up, right? And how do we do that process of ticking it up? We're doing that by setting this interval and calling stuff, right? So if our state is now we're in the running state, we want to start ticking stuff up. Otherwise, what do we want to do if we're not? If we are going or we just paused it, we want it to stop where it's at, right? All right. So that's instead of set interval, we call clear interval. And what you pass it is a handle. And the handle is this dot interval ID. Because you pass it the thing that you were calling before. Does that make sense? So let's see if this works. I don't know. Awesome. All right, we got something ticking up. So I'll probably let it stay this way for now, this code and logic. I'll talk to you guys real fast about what some of the problems are with this. This interval, this isn't actually guaranteed to happen within this time period that we gave it. It doesn't have to happen then. It could be delayed almost indefinitely. So if some other process is running and using up like our JavaScript thread, then if that takes 1 second to run, this will still only fire at the end of that one time. And it will only tell you that 10 milliseconds elapsed because of the way that we've got it coded. So it's not going to give you the proper elapsed time, the time you need to have recorded on there. As a result of that. Now we could fix that. And maybe we'll do that later, or maybe we'll have it as an exercise for people to fix it. That goes back to what I was talking about before, my earlier approach, which was capturing a time. And then updating it or doing a delta. The only deal is you wouldn't do it inside of your render. You would pull that outside into something like this tick. But you notice the big takeaways for today, right? Yeah, we've got this sort of stopwatch bit here that we added in. We haven't hooked up the clear button. So there's going to be a lot of exercises for you guys because we've got some other homework that people have been working on for you. And then I'm going to have a couple items here, one of which is try and make this prettier in terms of what you're outputting instead of just showing the milliseconds. Try and break it down and try and get the clear button functioning. You've got enough example code in there, enough reference to build off of that I think you should be able to figure out how to get the clear button working based off of what we have. I'll post this stuff tonight so that everyone can start with this as your base. So if anybody didn't reach this point, they can. But yeah, the two things I would like to see people work towards for class on Tuesday for this project is trying to make the display prettier in terms of breaking it down by hours, minutes, seconds, milliseconds, and trying to get the clear button functional. And then we can go back. Let's go back for a split second, just for fun. And look at our app here. And let's look at how easy it is. Again, boom, I just added a second stopwatch in. And they're independent from each other. All I had to do was write, because I've got this component that's self-contained now and manages all that logic, and yet it also has these very simple reusable components inside of it, I've got multiple stopwatches on my page without any real challenge at all. So that gets into some of the powerful aspects of working with React. Is I didn't have to do anything special to make those states separate. Whereas if I was writing this out as a traditional front end, like JavaScript heavy application, I would be doing all sorts of duplicate work or saying like, okay, well, I'm storing a different array to remember what each one of these are. All I did here was say, render another one of these components. That component manages all of its logic for itself. I don't care about it. Just render it again, and boom, I've got a second independent stopwatch. All right, are there any questions on this? This is a lot. But like I said, the big takeaway here was the notion of when you're working with state, especially state that needs to be shared between components, pulling that up. So saying, oh man, this is state that multiple things need to, in order to share for some reason. Think about, okay, well, I probably need a common parent that I pull that state into, and that's where that gets managed. And then that can simplify these. Like this start pause button now, it doesn't need to be a class component anymore. It could go back to being a function because it no longer has any state or anything else that needs to make it a class component. So we could simplify it again by turning it back into a functional component if we wanted. All right, I'm gonna end the video, and then if anybody has any extra questions or anything, feel free to